I guess it's my turn. Thank you. That was a great introduction. I'm going to touch upon some of those themes in just a few minutes. My name is Kate Edwards. I am now 26 years in this industry, and I'll talk more about the term industry later. If you don't know who I am, basically I'm a geographer and cartographer who found a way to not become a professor. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but I thought working in games and working in tech was a lot cooler, basically helping people with geopolitical and cultural issues in their content. I've also been quite on the advocacy side of things in the later years in my career, basically focused on helping make this industry better for the people I love in this industry, which is everybody who makes games, because I love this medium. I want to start this talk by reading a letter, an email that was sent to me by a student. This might resonate with some of you. This is a kind of typical of the response I've gotten from students over the last few years. I left the IGDA role about 2 years ago now, and I've been very active with education and advocacy and other things that I want to do. But I'll read you this letter. Dear Ms. Edwards, last year I attended one of your lectures at our school, and you inspired me. As you may have heard, in September and October, multiple controversies in our industry came up. And this is what I'm emailing you about. Within our school, we discuss things that are going on in the industry right now. Recently, the incidents at Telltale and Rockstar Games came up. We've gone into a lot of discussion about this and what we need to do within our school teams to minimize this behavior. In the Slack channel, I see a lot of "we need to unionize the gaming industry" messages, and I see a lot of "we need to get out of this mindset" messages, but it doesn't give me anything I feel any of us could possibly work with. They're just words. But to be honest with you, these incidents worry me. I'm concerned that when I come out of university, I will be forced to work as many hours crunching as you see in these incidents, and after all, these stories are not at all uncommon. I fear that while I love video games and I'm passionate about creating them, I will no longer be able to see my loved ones, and I'll be forced to work at a company that enforces ridiculous working habits such as part of their, quote, culture. As mentioned, we've discussed a lot with our school what we could do, but I'd like to ask you, what can we, the students of today and the developers of tomorrow, do against these practices? What steps can we take? What are the ways we could prevent this from happening? After all, we are the next generation in this industry. Is there anything we can do? Right now, I'm mainly afraid of what future awaits me. I hear this kind of message a lot. And I've even heard a couple people, even in the last day or so, express something along the lines of these concerns. So the question is, what can she do exactly? What can she exactly do to remedy these fears? And more importantly, what can you do? And most importantly, what can we do? Because it's not a one-person problem, obviously. This is something that all of us need to be concerned about and something that all of us need to be focused on. So in my time running the IGDA, I spoke to literally thousands and thousands of developers all around the world. I had a privilege of being able to do that, to talk to government officials, CEOs of major AAAs, garage indie developers in emerging markets, all kinds of different people. And one of the things that was very common, in fact, the most common things I heard among developers in terms of what they want out of this industry was feeling like they have some say in where it goes, feeling like they have what we would call leverage. And indeed, in the last year or so, in response to a lot of the stories that I was just showing up there on the screen, last year was a really shitty year for the game industry in all kinds of ways. I mean, every single month there was some major incident that kind of underscored how problematic this industry can be. Different companies with toxic cultures, layoffs, all of these kinds of things, ridiculous crunching hours. And of course, a lot of times, this is stuff we've heard forever. I've heard this ever since I started in this industry. But the difference is that as of last year, I feel we're actually willing to talk about it more openly. There's a lot more open discussions about it. There's a lot of people talking, to themselves more seriously, what can we actually do? And of course, the media has picked up on this. A lot of the games media, especially in the United States, they're basically, saying, yeah, maybe it is time that we have a union. What's interesting is the opinions about unionization have shifted pretty clearly over the last decade or so. So in 2009, the IGA, they used to do something called the Quality of Life Survey, which when I became executive director, I turned it into the Developer Satisfaction Survey. But in 2009, they asked the question, would you join a union? 32% of the people said yes. In 2014, it was up to 56%. So in about 5 years, and then in 2017, there was a study done by 2 academics in Canada, and they found that 66% were in support of a local union, whereas 82% were in favor of an industry-wide union. Just earlier this year, the GDC State of the Industry Survey also asked the question, and they found that 73% said yes or maybe to joining a union. Breaking down the GDC data a little bit more, you can see here, do you think that workers in the video game industry should unionize? Well, there's 1 out of 2 people, 50% almost, basically said yes, they should. The more interesting part, though, is the reality of it. It's like, do you think that they will unionize? And of course, there's a lot less optimism around that issue. But there's still a lot of interest and support in the concept. Now, one of the things that we asked in the developer satisfaction survey, we asked developers questions about why would you leave the industry, and in a lot of cases, people who answered the survey actually had already left. And you can see here, number 1 answer, I want a better quality of life. Over all the other ones. A lot of the other ones that kind of also resonate, found a job with better pay and hours, burned out, things like that. So there's all kind of around this issue of how they are getting treated as talent. Also things like which of the reasons captures why you chose to be self-employed or a contract freelance. There you go, number 1 answer, more control over working conditions. Now, just for context, these surveys, about 48% of the respondents were in North America, US and Canada. So it's not just, that's heavily weighted to North America, but there is quite a distribution in Europe and elsewhere. So that's just to give you some geographic context where these answers are coming from. And we asked, do you feel there's equal treatment and opportunity for people in the game industry? Again, most of the people were answering no, there isn't. It's not painting a very good picture, is it? Asking about the gender wage gap. So here's what the gender wage gap looked like at the last salary survey in Gama Sutra, which was, unfortunately, the last one they did was 5 years ago. But still, this is staggering, this kind of gap. You can see the largest gap is in audio. So if you're an audio engineer looking to go into that, just keep that in mind. How important would you rate the following? So diversity in the workplace. Well, fortunately, 75% of the respondents felt that diversity is important. They mean in any workplace, not just games. But then when we asked in the game industry, it was up to 79%. So that's good. That's a good sign, but that's not, basically we don't see that put into practice though. So you have people who support the idea of having diversity and inclusion in their companies, and yet we're still only on average 20% women in this industry from country to country. So what's driving these sentiments though around unionization and around why has that been increasing in the last decade or so? Well, work-life balance, obviously. This is the number 1 answer I get from people when I ask them, why would you want a union? They said, I don't want to crunch anymore. I want some control over my working hours. I want to see my family again, that kind of thing. The sense of unfairness. We've seen so many cases where management treats their talent like shit. And it could be for crunch reasons, it could be for all kinds of reasons. We see all kinds of incidences where publishers treat indies like garbage. The way that they sign them under desperate conditions, sign the contract and all your dreams will come true. And of course, then they find out that the publisher now owns your IP and they didn't read the contract because they don't have legal resources. Toxic work environments, which I don't need to talk about because Jessica will get into this in much more depth. And just a growing collective dissent. Wherever I go talking to developers, there's more and more of this grumbling going on. And I think a part of that is being illustrated by the contrast with the broader tech industry. Now, the broader tech industry isn't all, a Garden of Eden either. There's all kinds of problems in tech. However, what we see are companies like Google, Facebook, and others who are kind of in that tech space who offer much better benefits than most game companies, much better time off policies, paternity leave, maternity leave, things like that, compared to a lot of game companies. And so people are like looking over the fence saying, I could still be a programmer. I won't work on games, but I can go work at Facebook or something, and I can get like 3 or 4 weeks off vacation. What this really comes down to is this point of leverage, that developers feel like they want to have the ability to essentially influence the situation in which they exist. And a lot of people are growing more and more tired of the fact that they don't really feel like they have this leverage. And in reality, they actually don't, because if they did, conditions would have already changed by now. Now, leverage in the history of the game industry, especially from a game developer's perspective, looks like this. It basically is a holy grail. It is something that feels almost unattainable, because in all the time that the game industry has been around and that we've been creating games, we have not seen really strong examples of that kind of leverage existing. And so that's why it's basically 2018 was, I think, a pivotal year for the game industry. With all of these stories that happened, I think there has been that collective dissent across so many people I know where like, this has to stop. This is crazy. We can't keep seeing this kind of thing happen. And what it really comes down to is the idea of collective action. So basically, it's when people decide, they come together and decide to actually do something about it towards a common objective. But history has shown that that's not easy to do. Typically, individuals often fail to work together, and there's all kinds of, like people who want to be recognized. I want to be the first one to start a union, or I want to do this. It's like the ego has to come out of it. It's like it all has to be about the actual solution. But what's really effective and what we're basically striving for, what leverage actually can mean in the game industry, like it has in many creative industries, is the idea of collective bargaining. This is really at the core of what unions do. It's at the core of what guilds are responsible for. It's the idea that you come together as a group and you decide that we want to basically have representation between us and management or whoever controls the money. So it's basically when a group of less powerful people come together with similar goals, and they want to have a negotiation with a more powerful force, whoever that might be. Usually that's the management, the people who are hiring you. And so collective bargaining has been extremely effective in all kinds of industries around the world. I mean, we are very familiar with all kinds of unions that exist, like on the industrial side, the services side, and that's basically what they have. I mean, even when I was working at a project at Breda University in the Netherlands last year, and so I show up and I said, okay, I'm ready to negotiate my salary. It's already been negotiated. We have a collective bargaining agreement across the whole education system in the Netherlands. Like, oh, okay, so that's kind of cool. And also, as an American, I'm like, oh, so there's no negotiation. I don't understand that. But I was able to get, a decent rate. But it's interesting how it's like it was settled though, and there's basically everyone accepts the fact that they all came together, made the negotiation, and everyone is relatively happy with what they got. There's different kinds of leverage, however. It's not just about unions. I bring that up because that is pretty much the hot topic these days. But we're going to talk about various forms. There's unions, there's guilds, there's legal defense fund, just as an example, 3 major forms of leverage. So let's talk about guilds. So basically, it's the classic definition is that a guild is a collective bargaining organization for independent contractors. That's basically what it is. And so, people who are self-employed, generally doing a certain kind of profession, they come together and say, hey, you know what, let's protect each other. Let's kind of help set rates so that we're not putting each other out of business, and basically have some kind of structure for that. Guilds are a very, very old structure that actually go all the way back to the Roman Empire, where they first started this kind of thing. So like everybody who was like a bronze worker, everyone who was like a leather worker, they basically banded together within a certain city and were able to work together. In the medieval times, a lot of cities, like in Europe, for example, you would enter the city and you would see a post like this, which is showing you these are the different guilds that exist within this city. So you know that, okay, cool, well, I can get barrels made. Awesome, I need a barrel, or whatever. And so this has been going on and on for a very long time. Now guilds also had problems because it's a human organization, so obviously it's not always going to be perfect. Sometimes they can set prices and squash competition and things like that. That's a criticism that's often leveled at unions as well. But generally speaking, if you have different guilds in different cities, they are kind of competing with each other. So you say, well, wow, your barrel guild here in Salzburg is too much, so I'm going to go to Vienna Vienna because it's a lot cheaper, although it'd probably be the other way around. Anyway, so in Hollywood, there's a lot of the structures that exist right now for labor representation were initially started as guilds. So you'll see all of these names: Screen Actors Guild, Writers Guild, Directors Guild. They all started as a guild structure back in the 1930s. And so they have since then become legally a union. They are a form of union now, but they did start as a guild structure where basically actors came together, for example, and just said, we need to work together and try and work out the negotiation. What's interesting was when the Screen Actors Guild was formed in 1933, this is one of the sentiments that basically brought them together. So the studio contracts provided no restrictions on working hours, essentially gave studios ownership of the actors' professional and, to an extent, personal lives. Does this sound familiar? Here we are almost 100 years later, and we're in the game industry, and yes, this is this is one of the key linchpins that got the actor to say we need to come together and have better representation for ourselves because we're being taken advantage of. And in some ways, I see that the game industry right now very much reflects Hollywood in the 1930s. Back in that time, the studios were in total control of creation of film. They had the money. They controlled the talent. They could tell an actor, you cannot work on that film. You have to work on our film, even though it's a piece of crap. But you can't. Sometimes they would share actors, especially the really famous people. They would have deals where they would share, like Cary Grant, to another studio or whoever it might be. But at that time, studios had all the power. There's all kinds of books written about, like Sam Goldwyn, for example, who was a huge producer in Hollywood, who had just tremendous amounts of power. And eventually that changed in Hollywood. After they became unionized and guilds were formed, basically the power structure shifted from the studios more to the talent. Because today you see all these stories about actors. Basically the actors are calling the shots more than the studios to a lot of degree. At least there's more of a power balance. Now, a union, in contrast to a guild, which represents individual contractors, a union is generally formed to collectively bargain for employees. So that's why unions typically start at a specific company. They don't kind of start out in the ether somewhere. They actually start at a company where people came together in a particular working environment and said, we're not going to take this anymore. We're going to create a union. Now, of course, there are unions out there that exist, all kinds of unions that are there to basically support people in different industries. So generally, you don't see someone at a company start their own union from scratch. What they do is they affiliate with an existing union, for example, like car factories, whatever car factories are left in the United States, they have the United Auto Workers, that union, the UAW. So they would say, well, we're not going to create a whole new union. We're just going to be a chapter of the UAW at our company. That just makes it easier for them. And so basically what it is also, just to use another definition, it's continuous association of wage earners for the purpose of maintaining or improving conditions of employment. So you can kind of use that definition also for guilds to a certain degree. But basically, like I said, the difference is that this is for people who are actually employees at a certain company. Now, unions have a very long history, not as long as guilds, but you can see here, this is a scene from the early 20th century where they actually called out the National Guard to put down a strike, and we're ordering them back to work because everyone gets along. But this is a universal thing. It happens all around the world, even in nice, friendly Finland. They even have, or is that Norway? Anyway, they have unions there as well. What's really interesting I found is that with this Economic Policy Institute, when they're looking at the existence of unions over the last century or so, and you could see here that this is basically the aggregation of income at the top, in the top earners of society. You see, as unionization increased, there was more of an equalization of income distribution throughout society. And as union membership has decreased ever since the mid-20th century, we've seen this massive disparity. And of course, we hear all these news reports all the time about the 1%. And I mean, if you look at the statistics, how the 1% of the population in the United States, for example, owns, 75% of all the wealth in the whole country, things like that. And we hear about record profits, but then they're not distributed to the workers because the owners don't have any obligation. They don't have to do that. And that's what happens without some form of collective bargaining or some kind of structure in place. What's also interesting too is that we see less of a wage gap when unionization occurs. So this data shows that with a non-union, you can see what the gap typically was, and then with union. Now this kind of makes sense because in a union structure, basically you are equalizing the pay grade for every kind of specific job. So you would expect that to basically, if you are working in a certain kind of job, it's basically agnostic to who you are. It doesn't matter what your gender or skin color or anything. Basically, if you're in this job type, that's what you do. And so that's another a nice side effect that we've seen over time. There are a couple of unions that exist in the game industry right now. There's actually 3 that I'm aware of. So Game Makers of Finland has been around for quite a while. It's a bit of kind of somewhat of a quiet union. The STJV started in France in 2017. I think a lot of people, they may not have noticed that because, when it's Tuesday in France, you create a union. It's something that's pretty common. What really kind of started the whole conversation, though, is when Game Workers Unite showed up at GDC 2018 and really started pushing this conversation in a very vigorous way. And it was great. I've actually been advising on the side and kind of affiliated with what they're trying to do. And right now, it's basically a massive education campaign to help game creators understand this is what a union is, this is what it can do, this is why you should consider it. And out of this effort, actually in January of this year was the first union formed. The Game Workers Unite UK group came out of this. So they affiliated with the Independent Workers Guild in the UK. So this is actually a union now in Great Britain. And so it's obviously just getting started, but it's a start. It was better than nothing. So we'll have to see. Time will tell what they're able to accomplish in their locality in terms of creating that kind of leverage that people are wanting. Now, another form of leverage that's possible is a legal defense fund. So there's a lot of legal defense funds out there in all kinds of different capacities. A lot of nonprofits have legal defense funds. Different industries do as well. One of the more well-known ones in the media, in creative media, is the comic book legal defense fund. So the CBLDF was created, I think, about 30 years ago at least, basically because in the United States we had something called the Comic Code, where basically the government was regulating comic content, and so the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund was created to defend creators and help them, in court when they're trying to defend what they actually created and put into the comic book. So was a core freedom of speech issue, a First Amendment issue in the United States. So legal defense funds can do a lot of things. One of the things is provide access to legal counsel. They could help cover legal expenses. They educate on labor laws and workers' rights. The thing that a lot of people don't understand, like when they have a lawyer who works pro bono, when they work for free and help you out, basically when they're working pro bono, that means the lawyer's time is free. That doesn't mean all the filing fees and all the other court fees are free. And so even if you had a case against a publisher or against an employer, you'd say, wow, this lawyer is going to work for me pro bono. That's awesome. It's like, yeah, you could still spend tens of thousands of euro just on court fees in order to push your case through the court. And so that's what the purpose of the Legal Defense Fund is for, is to basically help support people who are in that situation. And like I said, also just to educate them, because if there's one thing that has been really disturbing to me is how many indies I talk to who they don't have access to legal resources, they don't know what their rights are. I talked to one studio actually here in Europe, an event at Nordic Game, and they said they signed their first contract a few years ago. They thought they were pretty savvy with the law, and they read, all these books and stuff, and so they read through the contract, but they didn't have any money to hire a lawyer. And so they read through the contract, they redlined it, asked all kinds of questions, and they felt satisfied, so they signed the contract with the publisher, and so then they worked on the game and they finished it, and then when they got done, they were handed this big check from the publisher, and they said, thanks very much for making the game for us. And they're like, okay, so when do our royalties start? And they're like, what royalties? This check is all you're getting because you made the game for us. Like, see this one line. There was one sentence in the contract that they thought they understood, but the legalese behind it, basically that one sentence meant that the IP belonged to the publisher. and they didn't realize that. And so they basically signed over their entire creation to this publisher, and they're pissed off, as they should be. This is why I actually created the Game Creators Legal Defense Fund. So this is a real thing that I started. It's based in the US because that's where I'm based, but I do have a lot of interest in expanding this. I haven't formally announced it yet just because I'm still getting it off the ground. But yeah, this is something that I'm really passionate about because while I believe unions and guilds are a powerful structure and can help a lot of people, I also think that actually just having access to legal resources and knowledge is going to help a vast number of people in this industry. And just get that education, because I am so tired of people being taken advantage of, indies being taken advantage of, people at AAA studios who are sexually harassed. They escalate to management and they do nothing about it, and then they get demoted or they get fired or some other way they get pushed out of the company. It's all bullshit. I mean, all of this stuff there are ways to have leverage against it. So you might be wondering, though, all of these kinds of leverage, is it going to prevent incompetent managers? No, we can't solve incompetence, really. It's not going to solve crunch necessarily, or layoffs, and all these other things. Basically, it won't, but it will help protect game creators from the effects of these things. So if you look at the Telltale layoff, or the Telltale closure actually last year, which was a massive, basically nuclear bomb that went off in our industry, to see a company that was so critically acclaimed and apparently financially successful go from 1 week onboarding people who had just moved to the Bay Area in California to start a new job, and the next week the company doesn't exist. And now their games are being pulled off of all the stores because effectively their games are no longer viable because the IP doesn't belong to the company anymore. And so basically just all of that just completely fell apart because of incompetence at upper management, in my view. We also have to remember, though, because at this point, typically people are wondering, okay, well, hey, this is Sweden. What do I care about? We've got great labor laws here. We don't crunch that much, so why does this apply to me? We do have to keep in mind that labor conditions do vary widely by geography, and so this is where the geographer in me starts showing maps. So here's a map of global labor rights. And so this is from 2016. As you can see, this was the latest data I could find that was actually on a global scale. So what this is showing you right here is basically these are laws that are on the books. So this map is about labor law. And so you can see the conditions. So darker is worse, lighter is better. And so obviously here in the Middle East, the labor laws are pretty crappy. Here in Europe, quite good. You can see how nice and light-colored that is. I mean, so this may not be a total surprise to you in terms of what this looks like. United States is kind of somewhere in the middle. Canada's a lot better. And so this is actually law. So now this next map is actually in practice. So this is actually the labor rights in practice, which basically means it may not be necessarily, they may be following the law, but it also is about what companies do. So in practice, it's a lot better because companies might fill in the gaps where the laws are not supporting the workers. So I will contrast this going back and forth, and what I want you to look at are places like, look at Belarus up here. So this is in law, this is in practice. Pretty crappy. In the United States is the opposite, though. So it's by law, but then in practice. Now, why is that? Well, it's basically because it's kind of infamous that the United States, our labor laws are pretty bad. They are not very supportive of workers. They're some of the worst in the developed world. And what that gap is basically being filled in by our corporate overlords. So basically, this is where the Googles and the Facebooks and the Microsofts and all that, basically they give employees a lot of benefits that are not actually mandated by law. And of course, this comes with a cost too, because one of the things that's really problematic in the US at least is we have something called at-will employment. And that's pretty universal in the United States. So what that means is that a company employs you at will, so at any moment, they can legally walk into your office one day, even if you're doing a fantastic job, they can just walk into your office and say, you know what, you're done. Pack up and leave by lunchtime. You're done. Why am I getting fired? I don't have to explain it to you. It's at will employment. You can just leave now. And if you don't, I'll call security. That's how it works. Now, of course, the management will tell you, well, that's okay because it's at will works both ways. So at any moment, you could go to management and say, yes, guess what? I'm leaving today, and I'm done. Of course, that power imbalance is pretty obvious. So And so this is the overall view. So if you take these two maps, so in law, in practice, and combine them, basically this is how it averages out. So you can see here, this is global labor rights. So, so obviously Europe here, it's got pretty good conditions. As you probably know, Germany has really strict labor laws that actually restrict crunch and overtime. You have to get permission to work overtime. But what I like better, it's not just about the labor rights and the laws. It's the fact that the culture in Europe and across a lot of European countries doesn't support working in those kind of conditions. Like, for example, I knew Hannes when he ran Iowa Interactive in Copenhagen. I visited that office and I asked him, do you guys crunch here? And he says, I sometimes wish we would, but these people won't. They come in at 8 or 9 in the morning and they leave by 5 or 6 in the afternoon at the latest, and that's it. And they don't work weekends, and that's just the way the culture is. And if you try and push somebody to work longer, they'll just say, hey, I want to go home, I've got stuff to do, I have my family to see or friends to hang out with, so I'm not going to do it. And so basically what it did was force him, and this is just one example, it forced them to basically adjust to the workers and the talent, it adjust to the talent's way of life. Guess that's the way it's supposed to be. Management should adjust to the talent, not the other way around. Another chart here, annual working hours. This is incomplete, unfortunately, the data. Basically what this looks like is, so you can see here, it's pretty bad in some places. This red arrow basically represents a typical 40-hour week. So in the United States, this is considered typical. So working 40-hour weeks. What this also incorporates is holidays and time off as well. So if that seems high, it is, because in the United States, we don't get a lot of time off. You know, you're lucky if you get 2 weeks of total time for the year, and you might get a little personal time as well at most companies. Some companies are more generous than others. And then finally this map, and I'm sorry, this projection change really bothers me because I hate the Mercator projection. Anyway, minimal annual leave. So just talking about how much leave you get, just another example. Look at how nice and dark Europe is there in terms of how much leave you actually get, or like here in Sweden, that's amazing, 23 to 28 days. I'm so envious. So, you know, in the United States, this is disgusting. It's not mandatory. You're not required by law to give your people any time off, which is crazy. So if you wonder why all these game developers in the US tend to, scream loudly about unionization and leverage and all this stuff, you're seeing some of the reason why, because of the conditions. However, while labor conditions do vary by country, and they do vary by geography, it's important to remember that solidarity is never confined by geography. So just because you're like, well, this doesn't apply to me, thank God, I don't have to worry about this, but you should worry about it, because these are your fellow game creators. These are your patriots, these are your comrades, whatever you want to call them. These are people who are working, alongside you, even if you might be part of a company that's based in the US eventually, but you're working along people where you might be working remotely, and you say, wow, I'm glad I can just stop working at 4 or 5, but I know these people are going to be working till like 9 or 10 at night or later, and it sucks. So we have to remember that and kind of think about that global solidarity as a group of game creation talent. So with Riot, for example, this whole walkout that they did recently, this is a huge telling point, I think, and I think this headline was appropriate. Like, it's just the beginning. So where do they go from here? Well, this is exactly that kind of pivotal moment at which unions typically get created. This is exactly what happened in Hollywood about almost 100 years ago. It took an incident like this to basically tip the balance towards one way one way or the other. What's going to happen? We don't know. A lot of that is actually going to depend on the people at the company, whether they have the courage to take the next step, and that's really what it comes down to. And so I encourage people to adopt this idea of the warrior poet as we hear in literature, but adopt this idea of being a creator advocate. And what I mean by that is it's not enough just to make games. I mean, it's awesome that we do, and it's a fantastic thing, but we also need to have an advocacy mindset in that wherever we're working, even if it's our own little indie studio, that we are actually trying to improve everything around us, the diversity and inclusion that we're doing, the working conditions, the fairness of treating each other with respect and kindness, the actual idea of kindness between publishers and indies. Wouldn't that be novel? And I believe that we can do this, that it takes every single person to kind of adopt that kind of mindset of being a creator advocate. So, and we can even do that in the games we create, of course. It's like I'm making a game not just to make money. I'm making a game because I want to change the world and change people's perspectives on a certain issue. And a couple of things I just want to remind you of as I closed here that are really important. And this might be obvious to you, but I find so many people who just forget about this sometimes. So first, the thing is we need to embrace our craft for what it really is. And what it really is the current evolution of human narrative. We are the ones who are defining how stories get passed along from generation to generation, from person to person, in a way that all these other media throughout human history have done. And yes, this is a very simplified list. But every one of these media have been responsible for forwarding human narrative. And so we are the ones doing that right now. That should make us proud. That should be something that we think is very cool. Not to say, well, I'm just part of an industry. It's like, yeah, we are. We are part of an industry. But remember, industry, that term is something that we use in the media to encapsulate what we do. That's the business side of it. Making games, it's about people. We know this. We're people making games for people. It's like, it's not just this big black box where things get done and it out-farts this new game or console or whatever it is. It's a bunch of people who are passionate about what they're doing and pulling this all together. The other thing, of course, is embracing our economic power. I think a lot of us understand this. We hear it a lot that games make more money than music and film combined. Well, they do, actually, but these are numbers from 2017. Think about the magnitude of it is staggering. When we mentioned in the introduction about being a cultural force, we are a ridiculously massive cultural force, and it proves it by the revenue that we generate. Look at the games compared to all these other forms of media, but even more so if you take all live sports around the world, FIFA, the NFL, baseball, every kind of sport you can imagine played live, we still make more money than they do, which is crazy. If you add esports and everything else, I mean, this is just continuing to rise and rise. And I mean, that is a massive economic force, and yet I still meet a lot of game creators who are they kind of meek about it. Look, yeah, I'm just trying to make my way, and I'm just part of this, kind of scrappy industry. This isn't scrappy. This is kick-ass. This is amazing to have that kind of economic power. So I'm tired of people when they say I'm just a game developer, and I still hear that sometimes. Or even when people say I'm just a student, never ever say I'm just a student ever, because you're not just a student, you are the future talent of the game industry, and you need to embrace it. So if you meet someone from the industry, I've even encouraged students to say I'm the future talent. How are you doing? It's not arrogant, it's the truth. I even have a couple of students that I met last year where they were asking me that same question, what can we do? And so one thing I encouraged them to do was write a manifesto on behalf of students of game design and game creation, the future talent of the industry, and write a manifesto that basically tells the game industry, this is what we expect from you. This is what we want the industry to be like. This is what we're prepared to make it be as we come into this industry. They actually drafted it, and I'm kind of helping them wordsmith it, but eventually they're going to put it out there for people to see and for other students to join in. I think that's great that they want to do that. So what I'd rather see is people say, I am a just game developer. The term just meaning, I am righteous, I am doing the right thing, that kind of just. That I'm trying to make something happen that has never been done before. And so I want to avoid this sentiment, that people are going to be afraid of coming into this industry. I mean, there's always trepidation about starting a new job and about leaving school and all that kind of thing. But wouldn't it be great if as you leave school, you actually have that confidence that there's people there who are willing to support you and that you have some kind of protection against these kind of wild forces that are currently at work. Thank you very much. So we have some time for questions, if there are any questions.
We do have time. I will man this mic. Does anyone want to ask anything? Or am I going to make one up on the spot? Do you want to come up? Thank you. That was absolutely fantastic.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Pelle. I'm a first-year student in project management and game design. Thank you for an amazing talk. So I was wondering, You talk about the importance of getting together and organizing, and what would you say are the biggest challenges or obstacles preventing this from happening? Is it just a question of getting people to get together, or are there actually forces working against it?
So the question about what are the obstacles to coming together as people, and what do you actually do? That's a great question, and that's one of the number one questions I've heard. So part of it actually, it's not a cliche, but part of it is having the courage to actually speak up about it. One of the things I see at a lot of companies is where people are unwilling to talk to each other about it because they're afraid, like, they're going to be singled out as like they're the troublemaker. They're the person that we need to get rid of. But I think if you have a group of people, and when I get somebody coming to me from a company saying, hey, I have a complaint against management, this is something that happened to me, I always tell them, get at least 2 or 3 other people to join you and approach management. Don't approach management alone. Because almost guaranteed there's going to be at least 2 or 3 other people in your company who are going to feel exactly the same way you are about this. Pardon me. It may take more time to kind of ask around, and you have to be a little bit discreet about it. But also depends on your personality. If you kind of have like this fuck it personality, then just openly ask people. If there's like a common area where people eat lunch or something, just stand up and say, hey, I'm really sick of this one issue. Does anyone agree with me? Raise your hand. So first of all is getting that kind of support and being willing to talk about it. And that does take a certain level of courage. The next part of it, though, is the harder part. So what do you actually do? Now, one of the things that I think more and more people need to do is actually have the conversation with management first, which can be very scary. But that's where you have to kind of feel out what kind of people are running this company. Now, if you know that they're douchebags and you know that they have a track record of being, unscrupulous or unfair or whatever, you might want to just go straight to a lawyer and have a discussion with a lawyer about what your recourse is, like based on labor law. What can we actually do to counter what this management did? Ultimately, I think that conversation is best had first. So you can go to a lawyer, just say, what are my options? Here's what happened. Here's what we're concerned about, we as a group. Do we have any recourse here based on the labor law in this particular jurisdiction? And if they say, yeah, you've got a great case here, then that's when I would go back to management. You don't have to immediately mention to management that you talked to a lawyer. You could just go back to management and say, hey, we're concerned about this. We'd like to have a conversation with you about changing this. And if they basically don't do anything, well, that's when you could call the lawyer up and say, okay, I think we have a case here. We want to move forward on this and take action. But I think it's important to at least, basically, I think it's important to give management the chance to respond before you actually do something, because actually that's better, because if they don't do something, you have an even much clearer case. I mean, it's like, we told you, we approached you, and you did nothing about it, and so therefore, we're going to take it upon ourselves to make something happen. And so that's basically the chain of events that I would recommend, is basically get a few people together who feel the same way, discuss what those things are, articulate, write down what exactly you're concerned about, what exactly about the conditions or whatever it might be are bothering you. And then I would talk to some counsel about it and kind of see, is this company violating local labor law, for example? And if they are, then I would, well, even if they aren't, I would go back and talk to management, but it helps to understand whether or not, if you're standing on good legal ground. Because if you're not, then it puts you in a weaker power position, and then you have to figure out how you're going to negotiate with management around the issue. So that's basically the steps that I would recommend.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hello.
Hi.
Philip Ferdier. Thank you for a very interesting talk.
Thanks.
Something that is talked about in Swedish school, but it's interesting from the perspective of game design. My question is, you talk a bit about culture where working in the US there's a lot more crunch versus the Nordic region. My question is therefore, would you say that this is due to a enforcement from the work or the office culture as well, or is there other factor to this?
So the question was about the cultural difference, like around crunch, for example, between the U.S. and like Europe, for example. Like, is it coming from within or is it coming from without? in terms of the cultural force. I would say in the US, part of the problem is, well, it's not just the labor laws or the lack thereof. It's the lack of enforcement. So, for example, when I was talking with a group of lawyers about my legal defense fund, they said, hey, I know a perfect way to get easy wins. We're just going to go after some game companies based in California because California labor laws are pretty strong, and all you have to do is just find them in violation. And because they're like, I know all kinds of companies that are in violation. They do it every day, but nobody enforces it. So I'm like, okay, well, that sounds good to me. So part of it's the enforcement of the law, but the other part of it is the cultural aspect. Americans are workaholics. And they seem to take joy and pride out of complaining to each other how much they work, and saying, "Wow, I'm on my phone all the time. Yeah, I'm out with the kids. Yeah, good job, Johnny. You made a goal. I need to keep doing my thing." We can't unplug. It's really hard for us to do that. I see that as less of an issue here in Europe. I think, like I mentioned with the Iowa Interactive example, I think the cultural values here are such that it supports an idea of actually having a life outside of your work. And whereas in the US, it tends to be much more intertwined. And sadly, in my view, people seem to relish that. That seems to have become our culture, is where work and life are basically the same thing. And yeah, we get a lot of joy out of our work, and I think we should, otherwise we shouldn't be doing it, but that can't be the only source of our joy, in my view. For some people it might be, but for most of us I don't think it is. And so yeah, it's kind of that centrifugal force in terms of what's actually influencing it. And I think it's a mix. I mean, it's both the labor laws, the enforcement of it, as well as the cultural values of the people, of the geography.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hey, Kate.
Hi.
Great talk.
Thanks.
And we've talked before. You know that I agree with a lot of what you're preaching. Mm-hmm. So awesome. Yeah. That said, I want to sort of bring a rubber, where the rubber meets the road, hit some reality here. I've done game development for a very long time, done other kinds of commercial software development. In my experience, game development is the most uncertain of any kind of commercial software development there is. There's so much stuff we don't know whenever you start a new project. And yet, we are always bounded by time and budget. Mm-hmm. And what this means is crunch, because it means, things aren't going to work, and suddenly we're going to have 30% of the project left and 10% of the money left, or 10% of our time left, usually money. Mm-hmm. Now, there is a whole bad management side of this. Just like, hey, let's have a toxic culture where we always crunch. Okay, that's bad. You said something in your talk about how management should come to the talent rather than talent come to the management, or yielding that way. Mm-hmm. Having run companies and having looked at the spreadsheets and said, if we don't meet this milestone, we go out of business. Mm-hmm. This is one of the primary blockers I see in terms of this leverage point. My workers could come to me and say, hey, boss, we're quitting, it's 5 o'clock. I say, okay, but that means don't come back next week. And not because I'm a hard-hearted bastard, but just because we don't have more money.
Yeah.
So how do we deal with this reality where crunch is never going to go away, as far as I can see, as long as we're making uncertain products that we don't know what we're doing, and more money is not going to magically fall out of the sky at us, unless there's government funding, but that's maybe a different topic. Anyway, so that's my question. How do we handle this mismatch in expectations and reality?
Well, partially, I used to have a slide where I would say crunch mode equals poor project management. And the thing is that I think this is an area where Europeans and people outside the US can really help us, because in Europe we have great labor laws and there are protections and the culture doesn't support crunching and all that kind of stuff. They still make games on time. They still are able to create games. They still are able to create a schedule that's realistic to the workers' time. It's kind of like the example I gave with I.O. Management had to adjust to the workers and basically set the time schedule and milestones to what they know is a resource in terms of how many hours people will work at any given week, rather than actually set a milestone, being ignorant of that or not taking that into account, and just saying we have to hit this milestone no matter what, and not realizing, oh my God, that means my people are going to be working 80 hours a week in order to hit that milestone. So part of it's kind of the cart and horse issue. It's like, which do we consider first? Do we consider the milestone, and that oftentimes can be a negotiation with the publisher, and I realize that that's often the bad dynamic, is that the publisher sets the milestone. They're the ones that say, we're going to need it by this date, and you just do what you have to do to make it happen. But that's one of those things where I know a lot of companies, when they're on the receiving end of that from a publisher, they're like, yes, whatever you say, because we can't afford to lose this contract. But there's got to be some level of pushback there. There has to be some way to say, look, we can deliver by this time because that's what the talent can deliver. I mean, that's what we know that they can deliver. And I honestly think, at least in North America, we're kind of in this bullshit cycle of where it's like, I've had these discussions with a lot of major companies who are like, we would love to not crunch. We would love to set a more realistic schedule, but now we're kind of locked in for 2020 and 2021. So we can't do it now, but we'll consider it after we finish the next cycle. Well, it's never going to be finished, because especially now with SimShip and with DLC and everything else, we're always creating. And so at some point they've got to just basically say, you know what? On this next cycle, this is when we're going to try and do things differently. But is that realistically going to happen? And to me, it takes leadership. It takes somebody to be willing to just say, you know what, we're actually going to make a change, and we're going to change our expectations on how many hours people can deliver per typical week, and we're going to have to adjust our time schedule accordingly to make that happen. I know that sounds like a pipe dream and unrealistic, but it's like part of it is a cultural problem. It really is.
Sorry, just a quick follow-up. Yeah, I'd have to say it does sound unrealistic, at least within the U.S.
Yes.
I think it'd be fantastic to do a study of not just labor practices, but funding practices in the Nordic countries versus the U.S. To see what are the consequences of running out of time and running out of money. My suspicion is that because of the more robust social safety net, both on an individual and corporate level, there's a lot more padding there. Because it is absolutely true. I mean, having gone back to a major publisher to say, we need another month because this happened, and you added these things, and trying to do the best management we can, and they say, nope, you're done. I mean, this is a very common story. So if that's not happening in other countries, we should find out why. My fear and suspicion is that we're going to say, oh, well, first we have to change the structure of our country and our jobs, and then we can change the industry. So it's a slightly more of a boiling the ocean problem. Anyway, thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so, Richard Bartle, yeah. One of the reasons that the companies can get away with this is because there's an oversupply of workers. People want to get into the industry. So here we've got 400 nearly students coming into the industry. There aren't 400 new jobs, so some people are going to have to leave. And if there are 50 applicants for every job, then obviously the companies can say, well, do what you like. You can all go on strike. We can replace you all tomorrow. Would you say that perhaps we have too many games programs, or not a big enough industry?
Well, that's a great question. And I think the answer, well, it's like, can you ever have enough industry? Well, it's like, because we have independent development, technically no. I mean, the industry is going to be as large as there are, actually it's going to be as large as there are consumers to buy the content, ultimately, because they're the ones who are deciding how big the industry really is out of that demand. However, I do think we have this dynamic where we have a lot of programs churning out a lot of graduates into a system that doesn't have jobs for everybody, which is why we see a lot of people actually come, I see a lot of students who say, well, I'm going to start my own studio when I leave. Part of it's out of desire because they want creative control over the content, which I totally get because they're creative people. But the other part of it is that the jobs aren't always there. It's like when I was at NHTV, which is now called Breda University in the Netherlands, they're churning out amazing graduates, but there's no real, other than Guerrilla Games and Spill Games, there's not much in the Netherlands in terms of jobs at all. And so most of these people all go throughout Europe, or they go to the US or Canada or wherever, trying to find a job, and it's not easy. I think one of the things that is important for students to do is, at least when they go to a job interview, I think it's really important for them to articulate to the recruiters exactly what they're looking for. And some people say, well, that's like making demands. I shouldn't do that. It's like, actually, you should. I've talked to a lot of recruiters, a lot of hiring managers who say they love it when students ask really hard questions, like, how much do you crunch? What's your diversity like here? What is your plan to increase the diversity in your company? There's actually a student last year that I met. So I had this talk with her about, what she was about to, interview for her first job. So she went to her first interview, and she asked the question about diversity because that's really important to her. She's like, so, what is it like at your company? But more importantly, what are you doing to actually change it and improve it? And they didn't have a good answer for her. And so she said no. She actually said no to her first job offer, and she said she walked out of that office, like, what the hell have I done to myself? But by the end of the day, she said she felt so empowered because she said no. And she was actually able to, she's like, I'm going to control my destiny. And fortunately, within a month, she found a job at another place, which actually had better situation. That's not going to be typical for everybody, obviously. But the fact that she was able to basically lay down and feel proud about the fact that she got what she wanted by, basically having the courage to do it. But that doesn't really solve the problem of supply and demand. And so we have to think very carefully. It's like how many people we're producing. And I think as people graduate from school, you have to be prepared to be flexible for what you end up doing. I mean, for crap's sake, I'm a geographer who works in the game industry. I didn't intend to be here at all. So, it's like you never know where you're going to end up. So you have to just be flexible and, you be persistent. Eventually you can come back into it if you don't make it at first. But yeah, that's a very long answer for a very big question though.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, sorry.
So sorry everyone that wanted other questions. We're going to have to cut this short. Kate's with us until Friday morning?
Yes,
So
tomorrow night, so yeah.
So catch her outside. We will have a 10-minute break while we set up for the next speaker. Take advantage of that, and we'll see you all in 10 minutes.